For a long time, there was a strong fear of fire in California. Everything about the way we interact with fire was steeped in that fear.
People have seen more and more large wildfire incidents in their communities. The fires that are burning and getting big are the ones that we can't easily put out, which means that they are more extreme in terms of fire behavior. We have a huge amount of taxpayer money and societal energy going into thinking about fire, but most of that is really thinking about how to keep fire out of the landscape and out of places we don't want it. The only way to stop needing the giant fire suppression complex that we have is if more people start using fire.
What we've been able to do is really shift that narrative. At the state level, we've actually changed the law around prescribed fire in a couple really critical ways. Fire management decision-making that's at the local level, and that puts that power in the hands of the people who are in these places.
Everyone has a need to improve fire outcomes in their community, so a prescribed burn association or community-led burning is a great entry point into that.
PBAs are just a good way to teach landowners, students, community members about prescribed fire and how we can manage our lands better.
And the thing about PBAs is it's thinking about how to bring fire to landscapes and to people. The only way to do that at scale is to have everyday people recognizing the power of fire and the importance of fire in the place that they live.
As a landowner, I knew that prescribed fire was an option for managing our own property, and that's how I actually got involved with our local PBA.
To have an area that had not been tended for probably 50 years with all sorts of debris on the ground made me feel that I would be negligent if I didn't take care of that.
The Butte PBA's motto is friends helping friends put good fire on the ground.
It's creeping along the ground and everyone's laughing and it's fun. Normal people in blue jeans and t-shirts and cowboy boots and ball caps, getting together, burning together, leveraging their resources, their tools, their experience. The Humboldt County PBA was the first prescribed burn association in the Western US, and that was in 2017, so not very long ago. We didn't really understand the impact that the Humboldt County PBA would have on California and on the Western US as a whole. But what we saw pretty quickly was that our phone was ringing off the hook. We're close to 30 prescribed burn associations in California right now, and that's just since 2017. So the appetite for this work, for people to have access to fire, is well beyond what anyone ever thought. And there are thousands and thousands of people around California who are involved in PBAs. There are 9 PBAs in Oregon now. There are several in Washington. So it really spurred a social movement. PBAs are very grassroots. It's really something that bubbles up at the community level.
Fire is a really unifying concept. It's something that can bring together all kinds of walks of life and help them not only achieve a common goal, but to see the value in other people's perspectives. We're here together actually acting to take care of the place we live.
We are educators, how to burn, why to burn, how to burn safely, and that you can do this. You're empowered to do this. You don't need a college degree. I've got a bunch of gear on right now, right? Looks super cool. But the thing is you need a good pair of leather gloves, good work clothes that are non-synthetic, and you can go burn with any PBA in California.
I don't consider myself to be a firefighter, certainly. We have people from all different backgrounds. We have people who aren't involved in natural resources at all, but they want to protect their community. They like living in a forested environment.
PBA might start in somebody's back 40, helping a rancher improve the forage for their cattle, or working around someone's house to prepare it so that if a wildfire does come, their defensible space is ready.
The operational side could be the more challenging side to navigate for certain communities, like if they don't have water resources or a volunteer fire department or some of those like equipment needs. But then in other communities, it's more the paperwork that's the big obstacle. Like you don't have anybody that is willing or savvy to navigate the permit process.
We have folks that just help us do social media, people that are good at sort of logistical things, preparing for events, feeding people.
We need interpreters, graphic designers, people who understand local ecology, people who understand local politics, people who understand the community's needs. Really, everyone is useful and everyone can bring something to the table.
It's really a community building exercise more than anything. We've created this different tone, and it's warm and it's inviting. And so the PBAs say, you want to try the drip torch? Come join us. And what we tend to see is that people who come out on the ground and see this work realize that it's a lot friendlier than they might have perceived.
A better relationship with fire is possible, and it can only help both people and the land.
It's good to put fire on the ground. Neighbors will notice. I think it's showing and doing is the best way to convince people that this is a good tool.
I see prescribed fire and community burning as a way to bring people back a sense of agency and heal their relationship with fire.
We got to bring fire back to the piece of land that I'm responsible for stewarding this last fall, and it was just such an amazing, happy day to see a forest that I know well and see it opened up again. And then the real magic has been this spring, 6 months later, watching what sprouts where. Even after one burn, the native species really moved into some of the areas that have been opened up, way more wildflowers, way more wildlife in there eating the new regrowth. And just kind of actually being able to watch that process has been the best reward.